Question to Secretary of State for Scotland. Number 1, Greg Hands.
Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to welcome you to your new role and wish you the very best wishes for 2020. And in answering the question, I would say the UK Government continues to work closely with the Scottish Government to implement the fiscal government agreed in February 2016, and I pay tribute to the right honourable gentleman who played his part in that agreement. A review of the arrangements is due in 2021.
Greg Hands.
I also welcome you to your position and also the new Secretary of State to his position. One of the interesting features about those negotiations, of course, was that we alternated venues between London and Edinburgh for doing those, which might be an interesting thing for other negotiations about to start. But one of the things about the fiscal framework, combined with the Scotland Act 2016, it helped create possibly the world's most powerful devolved parliament anywhere in the world. Could the Secretary of State tell us what have been, however, the consequences for fiscal devolution for Scottish taxpayers?
Well, he's absolutely right. The Scottish Parliament is the most powerful parliament, devolved parliament in the world. And it is much more, with those tax powers, it is much more accountable than it previously was. However, I regret their decision to make Scotland the most highly taxed part of the United Kingdom.
Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also welcome you to your chair and the Secretary of State and the Minister to their own new positions. Can I say to the Secretary of State, though, that when the 2016 framework was established, this, of course, was before we knew the impact of Brexit. The world has changed. There will now have to be real consideration as to what powers pass from Brussels, not simply here to Whitehall, Westminster, but, of course, to Holyrood. This is an opportunity for the Secretary of State to reach out cross-party and establish a proper framework for the future as to what powers rightly should now be with the Parliament and the Government in Scotland. But also, the Secretary of State has got to take responsibility to make sure that there is the financial package that goes with those new powers.
Well, in the spending round, there's an extra £1.2 billion for Scotland, so that's quite clear. As regards frameworks, discussions on frameworks are ongoing and they're proving to be successful. And there isn't a single power being taken away from the Scottish Parliament as we come out of the European Union. And if anyone can think of one, they should write and tell me, because quite to the contrary, the Scottish Parliament will have more powers after we leave the European Union.
Number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And if I could use my first opportunity to say what a privilege it is to be re-elected as the Member of Parliament for Murray, representing my home area, and now to also work in the Scotland office. Could I also wish you, Mr. Speaker, a very happy new year, as we say in Scotland, lang may your lum reek. Turning to my honourable friend, leaving the European Union will afford the fishing industry in Scotland and across the United Kingdom many opportunities going forward. We will no longer be shackled to the common fisheries policy, and we will control who catches what, where and when in our waters. This government will work tirelessly with our fishermen and coastal communities across Scotland to that aim.
Can I thank the Minister for his answer? It is fantastic to see him in his place, and I congratulate him on his new role. Scotland has a proud history of fishing the finest seafood, and that's something shared by local fishermen in Selsey, in my constituency. But there is great concern that the next generation are not entering the industry, and this is made more urgent as we expect UK fishing will grow once we leave the EU. Can I ask my right honourable friend what discussions he's had with colleagues to develop a pipeline of future fishermen and women into the industry?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that question, and I accept that for many years the fishing industry has not been the attractive job opportunity for young people in Scotland or across the UK. But when we leave the European Union, I strongly believe that there's a bright future for this industry in the country, and that will hopefully encourage more people to look to fishing as an area where they can have a successful career. I know my honourable friend has been a great champion for the fishing industry in Selsey, and I know she will continue to promote her constituency and its strong links with the fishing industry during this term of Parliament.
Angus Brendan McNair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When the Minister was a backbencher, he understood full well the need for non-European Union and non-European Economic Area crews to come into Scottish waters, particularly on the West Coast. Now, him and his colleague on the front bench, what will they do to make sure this can happen? Or are they going to demonstrate their powerlessness and nothing will happen, as has happened for years?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if I can prove what will happen is I could say to the Honourable Gentleman for Naheela Nanyear to wait for question 8, because the Honourable Gentleman for Strangford has a question on exactly that. I will be answering the point then, and I hope he's encouraged by the response.
We now come to Chris Law. Chris Law. Secretary of State.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 3, 6, 7, 9 and 13 together. There's no independence of thought in the questions. The Prime Minister has received the First Minister's correspondence, which contains the Scottish Government's publication, and he will respond in due course.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State repeatedly said to the people of Scotland during the general election campaign that, and I quote, "Every vote for the Conservatives is a vote to say no to Indy-Rep." Well, Mr. Speaker, that went well for them, didn't it? That message saw them lose over half their seats and left them with barely a rump of MPs. So will the Secretary of State now listen to the people of Scotland, as reflected by the 80% of seats won by the SNP, and support their expressed democratic will to choose their own future?
45% of Scots voted for the SNP in the 2019 election, and 45% of Scots voted for independence in 2014. The numbers simply haven't changed. And I would further add, back in 2014, the independence referendum came on the back of something called the Edinburgh Agreement, which was signed by Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, the then Deputy Leader. And in the Edinburgh Agreement, it said that both parties would respect the outcome of the referendum. And that hasn't happened.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A good New Year to you. The Scottish Secretary has anticipated that the Scottish Parliament will refuse legislative consent for the European Withdrawal Bill. He said, and I quote, "That is something we understand and respect because their position is that they don't support Brexit." When consent is refused today, how will his government demonstrate that respect?
Well, what we are respecting is the democratic outcome of referendums, which you don't respect. And the referendum in 2016 was a United Kingdom referendum, and we voted to leave the European Union. We're respecting that. And under the Seoul Convention, you have what's known as outside not normal, and this is a constitutional matter. It's not normally it's a constitutional matter of reserve. It's not normally under the remit of the Scottish Parliament. So we are delivering what the 2016 referendum requested us to deliver.
Amy Callaghan.
This Tory government is claiming that its 43% of the vote in the last general election provides it with an overwhelming mandate to implement Brexit. Can the Secretary of State therefore explain the absolute blinding contradiction of his own position when he says that the 45% vote for the SNP, providing 80% of seats in this Scottish seats in this very House, doesn't equate in a mandate for the people of Scotland to choose our own future?
It was a referendum 3 years ago. We are speaking for the majority of Scots. The majority of Scots voted to remain. The majority of votes voted, to leave in 2016, to leave the European Union. We are absolutely respecting that decision, whereas the SNP are not respecting it and wanting to tear up the United Kingdom.
Neil Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State's performance thus far is highlighting just how untenable this government's position on this matter is. He completely failed to answer my colleague's question. So can I remind him, his party enjoys 43% of the vote to deliver Brexit, and yet denies the SNP its right to give the people of Scotland its say with the 45% of the vote in Scotland that we secured. What is his democratic case for denying the people of Scotland their right to choose their own future?
The First Minister has asked for the right to set referendums in the future, to decide the context of those. We are very clear about this. Constitutional matters are reserved, and it would be completely wrong for us to hand those powers over to the Scottish Parliament, because we would end up in a series of never-endums. Bad for the Scottish economy, bad for Scottish jobs, reducing tax income, and therefore damaging already failing public services.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you. The UK government have ignored Scottish people's voices and votes in every election and referendum since 2016, careering on with both Brexit and austerity. Can the Secretary of State inform us what precise electoral event would convince him that Scotland's people should have the right to choose their own future?
Well, first of all, on austerity, the Scottish Government's own independence figures show there'd be a £12.6 billion hole in the Scottish finances, and that would mean real austerity. Regarding when the time will be right, both Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond said at the time it was a once-in-a-generation, once-in-a-lifetime decision. I don't feel a generation nor a lifetime have passed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome my right honourable friend and the Minister to the dispatch box? Doesn't my right honourable friend agree with me, though, that this document is just another expensive and time-wasting stunt by Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP? The people of Scotland chose. They chose in 2014 decisively to remain in the United Kingdom. And it's time Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP accepted that and move on.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by thanking my predecessor for his 4 years as Secretary of State for Scotland. Prior to that, 5 years as Under-Secretary. Before that, 4 years as a shadow spokesman. So, in all, 13 years as a spokesman on Scottish affairs in this Parliament. And I think the last person who held that role for that length of time was Willie Ross under Harold Wilson. So I thank him for all the hard work and service he's given to the people of Scotland. As regards the point he makes, it's quite clear that the Scottish Government constantly harp on about independence and separation because they want to deflect from the main issue, and the main issue is that they are failing in our school standards and they're failing our NHS.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the new ministerial team to the Scotland office. In Scotland, education standards are falling. In Scotland, NHS is also failing patients with missed waiting time targets. So does the Secretary of State share my embarrassment with the First Minister of Scotland that rather than sorting out these important issues, she's obsessing with independence?
Yes.
David Dewitt. Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that the SNP have got every right to continue making the case for independence and to do so with passion and with force? But what they don't have the right to do is to keep dragging the people of Scotland and Scottish business round the same mountain time and time again to try to get the answer that they didn't get the first time.
The right honourable gentleman makes a very good point. What Scotland needs now is a period of peace and tranquility, not division and rancour. We need to take the opportunities that Brexit will bring us, not least with the common fisheries policy coming out of that and other great trade deals, and go for a year, make 2020 a year of optimism and growth.
Rachel McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The NHS is a precious asset that's just as important to people in Scotland as it is to my constituents in Redditch. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the Scottish Government's obsessive attraction to independence is detracting from their focus on the NHS, and they should focus on serving the people in Scotland in their 12-week treatment time, which they've never met?
Yes, my honourable friend makes a very good point, and actually the Herald today highlights that accident and emergency waiting times have deteriorated in Scotland to a record low, with patients now waiting more than 12 hours, record numbers of patients now waiting more than 12 hours to be treated.
Belstride.
Follow, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ministers and officials have regular discussions with the Scottish Government on many issues, including the block grant. The latest spending round gave the biggest funding settlement for the Scottish Government in a decade, with an extra £1.2 billion to help grow the economy and invest in our vital public services across Scotland.
Belstride.
Would my honourable friend reassure the House that at the upcoming budget, the Scotland will receive its fair share of funding through the Barnett Formula, and further, that the commitments made by the last government in respect of the 8 city and regional deals will be honoured in full?
I can reassure my right honourable friend that Scotland will receive fair funding thanks to the block grant and the Barnett Formula, and that will continue. On city and growth deals, we're already investing £1.4 billion across Scotland and are committed to a deal in every part of the country, including my own area of Moray. We agreed to £32.5 million from the UK Government, matched by the Scottish Government, making it the highest funded growth deal per head of population anywhere in the country. That's actually a sign to constituents across Scotland what Scotland's two governments can do when they work together.
Murray Black.
I just want to quickly commend the work of the member for Edinburgh East in this role previous to myself. He did a sterling job and couldn't have set a better example. Yesterday, my colleagues asked the Chancellor for an explanation as to why the UK is delaying their budget until the 11th of March. Now, this is despite the fact that the Scottish Government must pass its budget by the 1st of April, and the 11th of March is actually the legal deadline by which Scottish councils have to have their budgets and set their council tax levels. Now, there was no explanation given yesterday, and I doubt I'll get one just now. So instead, I want to ask, if and when did the Secretary of State raise this issue with the Cabinet? And if so, what answers was he given?
Well, can I begin by welcoming the Honourable Lady to her position as the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland in the reshuffle by the SNP recently, and also pay tribute to the Honourable Gentleman for Edinburgh East for the work he did in that role previous to her. The Chancellor was very clear, I believe, to the new Shadow Chancellor for the SNP that there is nothing to stop the Scottish Government from setting their budget ahead of the UK Government from setting it, and the UK Government has already shared estimates of tax and welfare block grant adjustments based on the latest OBR forecast in December to aid the Scottish Government in these preparations.
Murray Black.
It's ridiculous for the Scottish Parliament to be expected to know what money it's going to be getting, considering that the UK Government hasn't told them yet. So I'm very quickly realising why many believe that this department is utterly obsolete. Can I ask then whether the right honourable member will at least concede that instead of Scotland needing to wait on this place getting its act together, and instead of having to wait for permission to be told what we can spend money on, can he concede that none of this would be happening if Scotland instead had the full fiscal powers of an independent and competent nation to let us get on with the job properly?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is asking to let us get on with the job. Us is the SNP Scottish Government in Holyrood, which is letting down our health service, is letting down our education service, is overseeing cuts to local government, which is affecting every local authority in Scotland. And perhaps it's not the amount of money that Scotland gets from this UK Government, which is the highest level in a decade. It's the way it's spent, or in many cases misspent, by the Scottish Government at Holyrood.
Tony Lloyd.
Mr. Speaker, those answers simply are not good enough. The Scottish Government in Holyrood, the Scottish local authorities are entitled to know what the block grant is in order to plan their future. Anybody who's tried to set a budget dependent on UK central government funding knows that delay in that makes it almost impossible to manage. When will the Scottish Government be given certainty about what that block grant is so they can begin to plan the future?
Well, I hope some of that certainty was given by the Chancellor of the Exchequer yesterday when he did give the commitment and the understanding that there is nothing to stop the Scottish Parliament from passing a budget before the UK Parliament does that. But we have shared the estimates of the block grant and the welfare, the estimates of tax and the welfare block grant with the Scottish Government. We did that in December last year, and we will continue to engage with them going forward.
Tony Lloyd.
Mr. Speaker, again, simply not good enough. Not simply can the Scottish Government not set a budget, Scottish councils can't. That impacts on NGOs, it impacts on business, it impacts on services. What the Minister is doing is a measure of incompetence. When will the Secretary of State say to the Chancellor, he's got to do more, there's got to be certainty, we cannot wait till March?
Well, as the Chancellor of the Exchequer takes his seat, I'm sure he will have listened to these discussions, and he also answered the points yesterday from the SNP representative. I was a local councillor myself before I entered this place for 10 years on Murray Council, so I know the important role they go through in setting their budgets. What has made it more difficult in recent years is the greater cuts they've received from the SNP Scottish Government at Holyrood, which is affecting our local services in Murray and across Scotland.
Mark Logan.
Question number 5, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To date, the UK Government has committed over £1.4 billion in Scotland through city and region growth deals, and that programme is going to be rolled out along to all the other regions of Scotland very shortly.
Mr. Speaker, I fully support our government's ambitious plans to make sure every part of Scotland benefits from a growth deal. And does the Secretary of State agree with me that the £1.4 billion that the UK Government has already invested in city and growth deals is another fine example of how Scotland benefits from being in a strong United Kingdom?
Well, I do agree with that, and it's just one example of how Scotland benefits from being in a strong United Kingdom. Another example would be the union dividend, which is worth over £2,000 to every man, woman and child in Scotland per annum. And I would further add, the Prime Minister has announced a further £300 million to complete these growth deals across all the regions of Scotland and also Wales and Northern Ireland. In October, I was pleased to announce the quantum for Argyll and Bute, and very soon I'll be announcing the quantum for both Falkirk and the islands.
Liam Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Secretary of State on being reappointed to the Cabinet? Of course, growth deals are important, but I wonder if the Government has any conversations with the Scottish Government and how they would plan to plug their 8% fiscal deficit in order to meet the fiscal deficit rules of the European Union at 3% in order to enter the European Union in the event of an independent Scotland.
The honourable gentleman makes a very good point. For an independent Scotland, if separation were to happen, for an independent Scotland to join the European Union, under the Maastricht criteria, the fiscal deficit would have to be 3% or less of GDP. That simply isn't the case. It currently runs at over 7%. So, as things stand at the moment, the economics are pure fantasy.
Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Borderlands Growth Initiative has proved to be very popular in the Borderlands region, and the initiatives that were within it will be implemented in the next year or two. Will the Secretary of State commit to the Borderlands having a second Borderlands Growth Deal?
Well, Dave.
My honourable friend won't be surprised that I missed the end of his question as our Prime Minister was cheered. But I think he was asking me to commit to the delivery of the Borderlands Growth Deal. We have the quantum announced, and very soon we're going to have heads of terms.
Anna Bardell.
Will the Secretary of State put to one side his fluffy rhetoric and answer this? When he's looking at the regional growth deals for Edinburgh and the Lothians, will he look at the mess that his government have made over the closure of the HMRC office in Livingston and the move to Edinburgh? And will he do as his predecessor did, come to Livingston in West Lothian, speak to my constituents, speak to the workers, speak to the unions and the elected representatives, and look at what can be done to fill the gap and the mess made by his government?
I'm very happy to speak to the honourable lady outside the chamber about her concerns on that, yes.
Alistair Carmack.
Speaker, on the subject of the quantum for the islands deal to which the Secretary of State has already referred, will he confirm that he will pursue with Treasury a basis that is different from the per capita funding of other deals, because otherwise the deal for the islands will never be a meaningful one?
The honourable gentleman raised a very good point. I mean, previously these deals have been done on the basis of per capita, and we recognise for the islands it's a huge geographical area, and per capita would bring a very low outcome. So we are in discussions with the Treasury about raising the quantum.
We're now